There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the plain, unassuming clothes of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator in an empty house. You don't recognize them as pivotal until long after they've passed, when you trace the map of your life backward and find a single, indelible point from which all the subsequent roads diverged. For me, that moment smelled of chilled air and floor wax, and it was illuminated by the unforgiving, humming fluorescence of a 24-hour grocery store. It was the moment Liam, my best friend, the person who occupied the very center of my gravity, stopped the cart in the middle of the deserted cereal aisle, turned to me, and said 5 simple words that rearranged the architecture of my entire world. He didn't shout them. He barely spoke them above a whisper, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be absorbed by the towering shelves of brightly colored boxes. He had been quiet for most of our late-night shopping trip, a particular kind of quiet that I had come to recognize in him over the past few months. It wasn't the comfortable silence of our shared apartment, but a restless, searching quiet, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation in his head. He had been pushing the cart with a mechanical, thoughtless rhythm, his gaze distant. I was walking a few feet away, near the refrigerated dairy cases, pretending to study the expiration dates on cartons of milk, giving him the space his silence seemed to demand. It was a dance I had perfected over 8 years of friendship, a careful choreography of proximity and distance, of knowing when to speak and when to simply exist beside him. But then the squeak of the cart's wobbly wheels ceased. I looked up, and he was watching me, his grip tight on the plastic handlebar. His eyes, usually a clear, easygoing blue, were clouded with something I couldn't decipher. "Walk closer to me." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of need, delivered with a strange, quiet gravity that made the air feel thick. My heart, that traitorous and hopeful muscle, gave a painful lurch against my ribs. For years, my entire existence had been a study in walking a carefully measured distance from Liam. Close enough to be his friend, his confidant, his unwavering support, but far enough away to protect the fragile, secret thing I carried inside me, the overwhelming, unrequited, and deeply patient love I had for him. I had built walls, mapped out boundaries, and learned to live within the spacious but lonely territory of our friendship. And with those 5 words, he was standing at the gate, not with a battering ram, but with a key I never knew he possessed, asking to be let in. I didn't know then if he was conscious of what he was asking. I only knew that my world had tilted on its axis, and the careful map I had drawn for myself was suddenly, terrifyingly, obsolete. The path forward was no longer clear. There was only the humming silence of the grocery store, the space between us, and the echo of his words, which were not a suggestion, but a plea. To understand the seismic shift of that moment, you have to understand the foundation upon which it occurred. Liam and I were a study in complementary forces, a fact that had been obvious from the first day we met as college freshmen, randomly assigned as roommates. He was all bright energy and easy smiles, a software engineering student who saw the world as a series of logical problems to be solved, while I was a fine art photography major who saw it as a collection of light and shadow, of moments to be captured and held still. He filled our tiny dorm room with the clatter of his keyboard and the enthusiastic chatter of his friends. I filled it with the quiet scent of developing chemicals and stacks of books on composition and theory. Where he was expansive, I was contained. Where he was verbal, I was observational. We should have been a mismatch, 2 celestial bodies with entirely different orbits, yet from the beginning, we found a shared gravitational pull. Our friendship was built in the small hours of the morning, fueled by cheap coffee and the mutual stress of impending deadlines. He would sit at his desk, lines of code scrolling across his monitor, his face illuminated by the cool, blue light, while I would be at my own desk, meticulously editing a photograph, adjusting the contrast until the image conveyed the exact feeling I had when I pressed the shutter. We rarely spoke during these sessions, but the silence was a language in itself. It was a comfortable, shared space, a testament to the fact that we could be completely ourselves, absorbed in our own worlds, without feeling the need to perform for one another. He understood my need for quiet observation, and I understood his need to methodically build something from nothing. He never made me feel strange for spending an hour staring at the way light fell across a brick wall, and I never questioned his passion for creating elegant algorithms that, to me, were as inscrutable as ancient texts. It was during that first year that I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a slow creep, a gradual realization that bloomed in the quiet moments between us. It was in the way he would bring me a mug of tea, unasked, when he noticed I had been hunched over my work for hours. It was in the genuine, unadulterated joy on his face when I showed him a print I was proud of, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to see what I saw. It was in the easy, thoughtless way he would drape an arm over the back of my chair while explaining some complex coding concept that I would never understand. Each gesture was a small, perfect photograph I stored away in the darkroom of my heart, developing it over and over until it was burned into my memory. I knew, with a certainty that was both comforting and agonizing, that he didn't feel the same way. For him, these were the simple, unconscious acts of a close friend. For me, they were everything. So I learned to be the quiet observer. It was a role that came naturally to me as a photographer, and I applied its principles to my relationship with Liam. I watched. I listened. I learned the subtle shifts in his mood, the way a slight frown at the corner of his mouth meant he was stuck on a problem, the way his eyes would light up when he talked about a new project. I became an archivist of his life, the silent keeper of his stories. When he started dating Sarah in our sophomore year, I was the one he came to for advice. I listened to him talk about their first date, the nervous energy buzzing off him like static. I helped him pick out birthday presents for her. I sat on our worn-out apartment couch and listened for hours when they had their first big fight, my own heart a dull, heavy ache in my chest, and I offered him the steady, uncomplicated support of a friend. It was a form of self-inflicted torture, but the alternative, a life without him in it, was unthinkable. My love for him was a room inside myself that I kept locked. I knew the layout of it by heart, every piece of furniture, every shadow on the wall, but I never, ever opened the door. After college, we got an apartment together. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world. He got a demanding but lucrative job at a tech firm, and I started a freelance career, piecing together a living from portrait sessions, event photography, and selling my art prints online. Our lives settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by his 9-to-5 schedule and my more fluid, creative one. The apartment became our sanctuary, a space that was uniquely ours. My photographs hung on the walls, quiet black and white landscapes next to his collection of framed patent schematics. Our bookshelves were a chaotic mix of art history tomes and programming manuals. It was a physical manifestation of our friendship, two different worlds coexisting in a strange and beautiful harmony. And through it all, his relationship with Sarah continued, a steady, 5-year constant that defined the boundaries of my own relationship with him. I was Julian, his best friend, his roommate. The person who always had a spare key, who knew how he took his coffee, who could be counted on to be there, no matter what. It was a role I had accepted, a box I had learned to live inside. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was enough. Or so I had told myself. The shift began subtly, a change in the atmospheric pressure before a storm. It started with the end of Liam and Sarah. Their breakup wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, painful erosion. From my vantage point, I saw the cracks forming long before he was willing to admit they were there. The late nights at the office became more frequent, not because of work, but because he seemed to be avoiding coming home to the tense silence that had grown between them. The easy laughter that was so characteristic of him became rare, replaced by a weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He started talking to me about it in fragments. Late at night in our kitchen, his back against the counter, a mug of cold tea in his hands. He spoke of misaligned futures, of conversations that went in circles, of the terrifying realization that the person you thought you would spend your life with had become a stranger. I listened, just as I always had. I offered quiet words of comfort. I made sure there was food in the fridge, and I respected the silences when he couldn't find the words for his own unhappiness. My role was clear, to be the anchor in his storm. The locked room inside me ached. A small, shameful part of me felt a flicker of hope, which I immediately extinguished with a wave of guilt. His pain was real, and my primary duty, as his friend, was to help him navigate it, not to see it as an opportunity. I reinforced the walls around my heart, reminding myself that my feelings were irrelevant to the situation. He needed a friend, and that was what I would be. Nothing more. The night it officially ended, he came home looking hollowed out. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked into the living room, dropped his keys on the coffee table with a clatter that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment, and sank onto the couch. I was on the floor, sorting through a box of freshly printed photos from a recent shoot. I looked up at him, and the devastation on his face was so profound it was like a physical blow. He looked like a building whose foundations had been washed away. All the structure, the certainty, was gone, leaving only a fragile shell. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. I didn't rush to fill the silence with platitudes. I just nodded slowly, put my photos aside, and sat on the floor beside the couch, my shoulder resting lightly against his knee. We stayed like that for a long time as the evening light faded outside our window, casting long shadows across the room. He didn't cry. He just stared at the opposite wall, his gaze fixed on one of my photographs, a stark, lonely image of a single tree on a windswept hill. It was as if he was seeing it for the first time, as if he finally understood the feeling of absolute isolation I had tried to capture. In that moment, something in the tectonic plates of our friendship shifted. He wasn't just turning to me for advice anymore. He was turning to me for shelter. He was emotionally unmoored, adrift on a vast and empty ocean, and I was the only lighthouse he could see on the horizon. The responsibility of it was immense, and the proximity it afforded me was both a gift and a curse. That night marked the beginning of the ritual. It was a ritual born of his grief and my silent, patient care. It began with movies. He couldn't stand to be alone in his room, surrounded by the ghosts of his relationship, so we started watching old films in the living room every night. We would sit on opposite ends of the couch, a respectable and platonic distance between us, and lose ourselves in black and white worlds. At first, he would stay awake, his body tense, his mind clearly a million miles away. But as the weeks wore on, exhaustion began to win. I would look over to find him asleep, his head tilted back against the cushions, his face finally peaceful in the flickering light of the television. I would gently pull a blanket over him, turn off the TV, and go to my own room, my heart a complicated knot of tenderness and sorrow. The first time he crossed the physical boundary, it felt like an accident. We were watching an Alfred Hitchcock movie, and in a moment of suspense, he had shifted closer without realizing it. When the movie ended, I saw that his head had come to rest on my shoulder. He was sound asleep, his breathing deep and even. I sat there, perfectly still, for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. My entire world had shrunk to the point of contact between us. The surprising weight of his head, the warmth of his body seeping through the fabric of my shirt, the soft scent of his shampoo. It was a dangerous, intoxicating form of torture. My body screamed at me to lean into him, to rest my own head against his, to finally give in to the gravitational pull I had been resisting for years. But my mind, the ever-vigilant warden, held me back. This wasn't for me. This was about his need, his exhaustion, his pain. To mistake it for anything else would be a betrayal of his trust. So I sat there, a statue carved from longing, until my muscles ached, and then I carefully, painstakingly, shifted away so I could get up without waking him. The ritual evolved. The couch became a less frequent venue as he began to have trouble sleeping at all. He complained of nightmares, of waking up in his empty bed with a crushing sense of loneliness. One night, around 3 a.m, my bedroom door creaked open. I was awake, reading by the light of a small lamp. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway, looking like a lost child. "Can't sleep," he mumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Do you mind if I just sit in here for a bit? My room feels too quiet, My heart hammered against my ribs. Of course not, I said, trying to keep my voice steady and casual. I gestured to the worn armchair in the corner of my room. But he didn't go to the chair. He walked over to the bed and sat on the edge, his back to me. He hunched over, running his hands through his hair. It's stupid, he said. I feel like the walls are closing in. It's not stupid, I said softly. It's grief. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, he lay down on top of the covers, on the very edge of the queen-sized bed, as far away from me as he could get while still being on it. He was fully clothed, lying stiffly on his back, staring up at the ceiling. Is this okay? He asked, his voice small. Just for a little while? It's okay, Liam, I whispered, my own voice barely audible. And so began the next phase of the ritual. It happened 2 or 3 times a week. He would appear at my door, a silent plea in his eyes, and I would let him in. He would lie on top of the covers, and I would stay under them, a vast, chaste territory of mattress and blankets separating us. We would talk sometimes, in low whispers, about nothing and everything, until his breathing deepened and he drifted off. Those nights were a strange mix of heaven and hell. He was there, in my room, in my bed, closer than he had ever been. And yet he was a universe away, separated from me by the unspoken truth of my feelings and the careful, fragile pretense of his need for platonic comfort. I became an expert in stillness, in controlling my own breathing so as not to disturb him. I would lie awake for hours, listening to the sound of him sleeping, mapping the contours of the shadows on the ceiling, and fighting a constant, losing battle with my own desperate hope. The line blurred further on a cold night in November. A storm was raging outside, the wind rattling the window panes. He came into my room, shivering, and this time when he lay down, he pulled the edge of the duvet over himself. The space between us shrank from a continent to a small country. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could feel the slight dip in the mattress from his weight. I lay on my side, facing away from him, my back a rigid wall of self-control. After a few minutes of silence, I felt a tentative touch against my back. It was his hand, resting lightly on my shoulder blade. Julian, he whispered. I could barely get the word out. Yeah. Thanks, he said. For this. For everything. His hand remained there, a small point of searing heat. Then, slowly, he drifted off to sleep. His hand stayed on my back, a silent, unconscious anchor. I did not sleep at all that night. I was too busy being exquisitely aware of every single nerve ending in my body, of the monumental weight of his simple, trusting touch. This was the landscape of our new relationship, a territory of plausible deniability. In the morning, he would wake up and pull away, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, as if he wasn't quite sure how his hand had ended up there. He would mumble a quick thank you and escape to the shower, and we wouldn't speak of it. Every touch, every inch closer he moved in the night, was filed away under the category of unconscious comfort-seeking. He needed the deniability, and I, terrified of losing him, granted it to him. I became the silent curator of these ambiguous moments, hoarding them like precious artifacts, all while knowing they were probably meaningless. This delicate, painful dance continued for months. The space between us and the bed became smaller and smaller, until one night I woke up to find his arm thrown over my waist, his face buried in my back. He was holding on to me in his sleep as if I were a lifeline. My carefully constructed walls crumbled to dust in that moment. The line between friendship and something more had become so blurred it was no longer visible. He was seeking a level of physical intimacy from me that he had previously reserved only for a romantic partner. Yet he did it all under the protective cloak of sleep and grief. He was, I realized, the unknowing initiator. He was pushing every boundary, crossing every line, but without any conscious acknowledgement of what he was doing. And I, the quiet observer, was letting him, because the thought of pushing him away was more painful than the agony of this uncertainty. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the hope that his actions meant something and the terror that they meant nothing at all. And that brings us back to the grocery store. That night felt different from the start. A wave of anxiety had been rolling off him all day. He had been let go from his job. Downsizing, they called it. A cold, corporate term for appending someone's life. For a man like Liam, who defined so much of his self-worth by his ability to solve problems and be productive, the blow was catastrophic. It wasn't just a job, it was his structure, his identity. Combined with the lingering heartbreak from Sarah, he was completely adrift. He paced the apartment for hours, unable to settle, the restless energy crackling around him. Around midnight, I suggested we go out. Out where? He'd asked, his voice flat. I don't know. Let's just get some groceries. The store will be empty. We can just walk around. It was a flimsy excuse, but he agreed, desperate for any kind of distraction. The grocery store was just as I'd predicted, cavernously empty, eerily quiet. The bright lights seemed to bleach all the color from the world, creating a sterile, surreal landscape. We moved through the aisles in our usual silence, but this was a new iteration of it. It was heavier, charged with his fresh despair. He wasn't just sad anymore. He was scared. I could feel it. And I think, for the first time, he was scared of the sheer depth of his loneliness, a feeling that even my constant presence couldn't entirely fix. So when he stopped the cart in the cereal aisle, his knuckles white on the handlebar, and looked at me with that raw, desperate expression, it felt like a culmination of everything that had been building for months. All the sleepless nights, all the unspoken touches, all the carefully maintained boundaries. Walk closer to me. It was different from the unconscious gestures in the dark of my bedroom. This was conscious. This was a request made in the full, harsh light of a public space. He was awake. He was looking right at me. He was, for the first time, actively and knowingly asking me to close the distance between us. And in his eyes, I saw not just need, but a flicker of confusion and fear, as if he was as surprised by his own words as I was. He was finally acknowledging the gravitational pull that had been silently operating between us, and it terrified him. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. I closed the few feet of space between us, my sneakers squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. I stopped beside him, so close that our shoulders were almost touching. I didn't look at him. I stared straight ahead at the rows of cartoon mascots and cheerful promises of a balanced breakfast. My entire being was focused on the tiny space that remained between our bodies, a space that felt charged with a powerful, terrifying electricity. He let out a shaky breath he seemed to have been holding. He didn't say thank you. He just started pushing the cart again, slowly, deliberately, and I walked beside him, closer than I had ever dared to walk before, matching him step for step. We were a silent procession of two, moving through the empty aisles, a new, unspoken agreement hanging in the air between us. The map was gone. We were in uncharted territory now, and for the first time, I had the distinct and terrifying feeling that I was no longer the only one holding the compass. The weeks following the grocery store incident were a study in quiet tension. The ritual in my bedroom continued, but it had changed. There was a new self-awareness to it, a deliberateness that hadn't been there before. When Liam came to my room now, he would meet my eyes for a moment longer than necessary. When he lay down, the space he left between us felt less like a boundary and more like a question. The touches in the night no longer felt accidental. I would wake to find his hand intertwined with mine, his fingers laced through my own, a gesture too specific, too intricate to be dismissed as a sleepy accident. He was holding my hand. And in the morning, he would pull away with a gentleness that felt like an apology, his gaze flickering away from mine. We were like two people standing on opposite sides of a gorge, whispering to each other across the void, both too afraid to be the first to build a bridge. The crossing finally came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The sky was the color of slate, and a steady drizzle whispered against the window panes, blurring the world outside. We were in the living room, a space that had become our sanctuary and our stage. I had been working on a new project, a series of portraits, not of clients, but of him. I had been taking them for weeks, candid shots when he wasn't paying attention. Liam asleep on the couch, his face softened in the dim light. Liam staring out the window, lost in thought, the rain-streaked glass reflecting his pensive expression, Liam at the kitchen table, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips as he looked at something on his laptop. They were intimate, honest, and probably a catastrophic breach of the unspoken rules of our friendship. I had spread the test prints out on the hardwood floor, arranging and rearranging them, trying to find the narrative thread. Liam had been in his room most of the day, but he emerged, drawn by the silence, and found me sitting amidst a sea of his own face. He stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I froze, my heart seizing with panic. I had been caught. My secret, locked room had been thrown open, its contents spilled across the floor for him to see. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Just a project I'm working on," I said, my voice sounding thin and weak to my own ears. I started to gather the prints, my hands clumsy. "Don't," he said, and the word was so soft but so firm that I stopped immediately. He walked slowly into the room and knelt down on the floor opposite me, the scattered photographs lying between us like fallen leaves. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at them, one by one. He studied the image of himself sleeping, his gaze lingering on the vulnerability in his own unguarded features. He picked up the one of him smiling, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the print. I watched him, my breath caught in my throat, bracing myself for the inevitable question, for the awkwardness, for the end of everything. When he finally looked up, his eyes were shining with an emotion I couldn't name. It was a complex cocktail of wonder and sadness, and a startling, raw vulnerability. "This is how you see me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. The truth was right there, laid bare on glossy paper. It was a confession made in light and shadow, a love letter written in silver halide. There was no hiding it now. He looked away from the photos and met my gaze directly. The space between us, across the scattered images of his own face, felt vast and yet incredibly small. The rain pattered against the glass, a soft, steady rhythm marking the passage of time. He seemed to be having an internal war with himself, his expression shifting, his jaw tight. I could see the fear in his eyes, but underneath it, there was something else. Something new. A kind of dawning recognition. "Julian," he said, his voice cracking slightly on my name. I waited. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. He took a shaky breath. "Would it be okay?" he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. He tried again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air, delicate and fragile as a soap bubble. It was the bridge. He had built the bridge and was asking me, with terrifying gentleness, if I was willing to cross it with him. All the years of waiting, of hoping, of aching, all the nights of lying awake next to him, all the carefully constructed walls and boundaries, it all led to this single, terrifying, beautiful question. My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, suddenly went still. In that moment, all the fear, all the anxiety melted away, replaced by a profound and overwhelming clarity. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I simply leaned forward, closing the final distance between us, and gently pressed my lips against his. It was not a passionate kiss, or a desperate one. It was a kiss of profound relief. It was quiet and tentative, and it tasted of rain and salt and years of unspoken things. It was a confirmation, an answer, a beginning. It was the sound of a locked door finally clicking open. The aftermath was not the explosion of joy I might have fantasized about during all those lonely years. It was silence, a dense, heavy silence that was entirely different from the comfortable quiet we had always shared. After the kiss, which had been brief and impossibly gentle, Liam had pulled back as if burned. The look on his face was one of sheer, unadulterated panic. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a kind of horrified shock, not at me, but at himself. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over a few of the photographs in his haste. I can't," he stammered, not looking at me. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements jerky and agitated. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." And then he was gone, retreating into his bedroom and closing the door behind him with a soft, definitive click. The sound echoed in the silent apartment like a gunshot. I was left alone on the floor, surrounded by the evidence of my love and the ghost of a kiss. The hope and clarity of a moment before evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I had misinterpreted everything. The grocery store, the hand-holding in the night, the question. It had all been a product of his confusion and grief, a desperate reach for comfort that had gone too far. He had crossed a line he never meant to cross, and now he was horrified by it. And I, in my foolishness, had let him. I hadn't just let him, I had met him halfway. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. The apartment, once our shared sanctuary, became a battlefield of unspoken tension. We moved around each other like ghosts, occupying the same space, but never at the same time. If I was in the kitchen, he stayed in his room. If he emerged to get a glass of water, I would retreat to my own. The silence was an active, malevolent thing. It was suffocating. The easy intimacy we had built, even the ambiguous, painful version of it, was completely gone. The door to my bedroom remained shut at night. The bed felt impossibly large and empty. I felt the loss of our friendship more acutely than I had ever felt the ache of my unrequited love. In reaching for something more, it seemed I had shattered the beautiful, precious thing we already had. I spent those 3 days in a haze of misery, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. I analyzed every microsecond of it, searching for a clue I might have missed. But all I could remember was the softness of his lips and the overwhelming sense of rightness I had felt. And then, the panic in his eyes. I packed away the portraits, hiding them in a box at the back of my closet. I couldn't bear to look at them. They felt like documents of my own delusion. By the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was a poison, and it was killing me slowly. I knew I had to do something, even if it meant forcing an ending that would break my heart. Anything was better than this agonizing limbo. I waited until I heard him in the kitchen that evening. I took a deep breath, my hands clammy, my heart a frantic bird in my chest, and walked out to face him. He was standing at the counter, staring into a coffee mug, his shoulders slumped. He looked as exhausted and miserable as I felt. He didn't look up when I came in. "Liam," I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady. He flinched at the sound of his name, but didn't turn around. "Julian, no," I said, cutting him off gently. "Let me talk first. Please." He fell silent. I walked closer, stopping a few feet behind him. "I need you to be honest with me," I began, the words I had rehearsed in my head 100 times spilling out. "What happened on Saturday? I won't pretend it was nothing to me. It wasn't. But I need to know what it was to you. If it was a mistake, if it was just confusion, you can tell me. I can handle it. I promise I can handle it. I can't handle this. This silence. It's breaking me. Our friendship is the most important thing in my life, and I feel like I'm losing it. So please, whatever the truth is, just tell me. Even if it's not what I want to hear." The silence is so much worse. For a long moment, he didn't move. His back was still to me, a rigid wall. I could see the tension in his shoulders. I thought, for one terrible second, that he was just going to walk away. But then, his shoulders began to shake. A choked sob escaped him, a sound of such profound pain that it ripped through me. He turned around, and his face was a wreck of conflicting emotions. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, his expression a mixture of shame and fear and a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "That's the honest truth, Julian. I don't know what I'm doing." He collapsed onto one of the kitchen chairs, burying his face in his hands. I moved to his side, my instincts as his friend overriding my own hurt. I placed a hand on his back, a gesture that had once been so familiar and was now fraught with a new, terrifying weight. "Talk to me," I urged, my voice soft. And he did. The words came out in a torrent, a confession that had been dammed up behind his fear and confusion. He talked about how, after Sarah left, he had felt a kind of emptiness he had never known. He said that my presence, my quiet, unwavering support, was the only thing that had kept him from completely falling apart. He admitted that the nights in my room started as a genuine need to not be alone, but that somewhere along the way, it had changed. He started to crave it, to need the feeling of my presence beside him in the dark. He confessed that he started to notice things. The way I would look at him when I thought he wasn't paying attention. The specific brand of tea I always kept stocked just for him. The way I knew what he needed before he did. I started feeling things, he said, his voice muffled by his hands. Things I didn't understand. It felt safe. Being with you. Safer than I've ever felt with anyone. And it scared the hell out of me. Because it didn't fit. It didn't fit with who I thought I was. He looked up at me then, his blue eyes red-rimmed and pleading. Kissing you, it wasn't a mistake. It felt right. Terrifying, but right. And that's what made me panic. It felt more real than anything I felt with Sarah for the last 2 years. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what to do with it. I was so afraid of ruining this, of ruining us, that I just shut down. I listened, my own tears blurring my vision. All the pain and uncertainty of the past few days, the past few months, the past few years, began to recede, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He wasn't disgusted by what had happened. He was struggling to reconcile his actions and his feelings with a lifetime of self-perception. He was just as lost in this uncharted territory as I was. I knelt in front of him, so our eyes were level. You don't have to know what it means right now, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You don't have to have it all figured out. We can be scared together. We can be confused together. But we have to do it together. Not in separate rooms, in silence. Whatever this is, Liam, we can figure it out. As long as we're talking, he looked at me, a flicker of hope dawning in his exhausted eyes. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and cupped my cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear. Okay, he whispered. Okay. Together. The resolution didn't arrive like a sudden sunrise, but like a slow, gentle dawn, the light returning to the world incrementally. There was no grand romantic declaration, no immediate solution to all our fears. Instead, we began to build something new, brick by brick, on the foundation of the honesty we had finally found. We talked. For hours. That night, and the next day, and the day after that. We talked about his fears, about my years of hidden feelings, about what our friendship meant to both of us. It was messy and awkward, and sometimes painful, but it was real. The suffocating silence had been replaced by the sound of two people learning a new language together. The ritual returned, but it was transformed. That first night, after our conversation, as we were getting ready for bed, he hesitated at the door to my room. I looked at him and simply held back the covers on the empty side of the bed. It was an invitation, clear and unambiguous. He walked in, and when he lay down, he turned to face me. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. This time, we were both awake. This time, it was not a question, but a choice. I fell asleep that night to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his breathing, his hand holding mine in the quiet dark, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt a profound sense of peace. Our apartment, which had so recently been a landscape of tension, once again became our sanctuary. But it was different now. The very air seemed to have changed. It was filled with a new kind of intimacy, one that was intentional and cherished. The small, domestic moments took on a new significance. Making coffee together in the morning, his arm brushing against mine as we reached for the mugs. Sitting on the couch, not on opposite ends, but with my head resting on his shoulder, his arm securely around me. These were the simple, quiet affirmations of what we were becoming. There was no more plausible deniability, no more analyzing every gesture. There was only a gentle, growing certainty. A few weeks later, we found ourselves needing groceries again. As we walked into the bright, sterile cavern of the supermarket, I felt a flicker of the old anxiety. This place was a landmark in our story, the site of the first major tremor. Liam seemed to feel it too. He was quiet as he grabbed a cart. We walked to the first aisle, and he stopped, turning to me. He smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He held the handle of the cart with one hand and held his other hand out to me. I took it without hesitation. "Walk closer to me," he said, his voice low and full of a warmth that had been absent that first time. This time, it was not a plea born of desperation. It was a simple, beautiful statement of fact. It was a summary of everything we had been through and everything we had become. I stepped closer, our hands joined, and we walked through the aisles together, a silent procession of two, no longer separated by fear or uncertainty, but connected by a choice we were making with every single step. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, curled up against his back, his hand resting on my hip, I thought about the box of photographs hidden in my closet. I realized I didn't need to hide them anymore. What I had seen in him, the vulnerability and the strength, the loneliness and the capacity for joy, was not a figment of my own longing. It was real. He was letting me see it now, letting me capture it not just with my camera, but with my heart. The quiet observer and the unknowing initiator had finally found their way to the same place. We never did put a label on it, not for a long time. There was no need. The words felt inadequate to describe the quiet, sturdy thing we were building. It was more than friendship, deeper than romance. It was a homecoming. It was the profound and simple peace of finding your exact place in the world and discovering that it is not a place at all, but a person. We had navigated the terrifying, uncharted territory of our own hearts and found that the safest harbor was the one we had created together in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to share.